math. It's math I haven't really looked at because I'm not prioritizing any particular genre or type of or type of developer or location of a developer. But
Right.
I mean, it's interesting. A cool group to look at if you haven't checked them out is like Indie Fund, because
Yep.
that's just a group that funds projects in a way that's very reasonable. Like the amounts are usually a little smaller, but they have a just unbelievable experience and flexibility in terms, and like the people that are behind the indie fund are just absolutely some of the most outstanding indie devs out there. So it's a cool group.
Nice. Well, one thing am curious about before we kind of like dive into this a little bit further is kind of like your story or SkyMap's story, and how you guys came a publisher to. So I guess to start, like, well, let's see here. Like, could you provide a quick? I know you kind of did this in the intro, but could you provide like a quick history as far as like what SkyMap did as a developer to be sustainable and kind of those things, like provide some examples and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, it's a funny thing because SkyMap, to become sustainable, stopped making our own games. I mean, the reality is that we got into game development to make a game called Bacon Man, which when we launched on Steam did meh. It made enough that we felt comfortable taking that cash and sort of reinvesting it back into other areas of the company, but it never did well enough that we could, take all that money and go and start digging into indie games publishing. So it's not like, Tiny Build or one of those other publishers that they started as devs, they got a huge hit and a giant cash influx and then reinvested that into new projects. For us, the best decision that we made was using Bacon Man as sort of the ultimate portfolio piece for the studio, and then going out and transitioning into work for hire. And so we now have probably about 25 devs working across 8 different projects, and that's been much more sustainable for us because we've got a level of expertise that we could bring to the sort of high-end indie market, or like AA market, which are like slightly smaller studios. That's been really beneficial for a lot of those teams. But what that's also awarded us is while it's not a big explosive, hit of infusion of cash like a lot of the games that explode for some of these studios, it does give us enough that we can pick a few projects every year that make a lot of sense for us to fund, and then pursue them that way. And so this whole pivot's probably taking the first 5 years of SkyMap's existence for like Bacon Man and work for hire, and the last 2 years have been like work for hire really ramping up, and in the past 6 months sort of starting this pivot into small games publishing and co-development, which is slightly different. So it's definitely it's a long-term strategy, and it's really just sort of started kicking off.
Okay, cool. Now you pretty much answered this already, but I figured it'd be good to kind of look outward as well. But like, how would you best describe the current status of SkyMap Games in terms of like, are you a developer, a publisher, a collaborator? And we got a sense of that, but I'm also thinking not just current status, because you kind of told us what you are now, but where do you guys see yourself in the future too?
Yeah, so right now there's like a spectrum, right? On one side there's work for hire, so like a client hires SkyMap for contributions on a project, and this is great because it keeps our team learning and it's profitable.
Yep.
But then there's what we call co-development, which is projects that we work side by side with the developers to help them, get the game to market and do it better and faster than what they would do on their own. Then you have this publishing side, which is it's pretty variable in terms of what people are looking for, but sometimes it might be we just need what every indie dev needs is just money, right? So like sometimes it's just money. Sometimes it's we want help with delivering on a marketing budget, or we need assistance with XYZ areas, porting costs, that sort of thing. And then there's original IP, which we've actually not given up on, but we've started rebooting that process. So like all in all is probably 8 work for hire, 1 or 2 co-development, 3 or 4 publishing, and 1 or 2 original IPs, all sort of happening at the same time. And the problem becomes like how you're spending your time and where you're putting your focus. And so what I see SkyMap's future is not removing work for hire entirely, but reducing the amount of work for hire very slowly and pivoting more into those co-development, publishing, and original IP pieces.
Okay, no, that's really cool, and I mean, it makes sense. Like, the type of stuff we're talking about here isn't nothing that you just sit down one day and be like, okay, in a few months we're going to be doing this.
Right. Like I'm sure that if we wanted to take a bigger risk, right, we probably could push a lot harder and faster into those areas. But the problem is when you have payroll for 25 people, it's like, well, that's probably not a smart decision, because what you don't want to do is risk anybody's safety net.
Right.
We always try to keep a really hefty safety net to make sure that people are covered, because like who would have anticipated COVID being as crazy as it is? Like you have to be smart, and there's an amount of risk that we consider acceptable, but definitely not trying to put any of the business or the folks who work so hard for us at stake.
Yeah. And I mean, from what I know about you and SkyMap Games too, and I would say this is a big important component to it, so which is why I want to kind of ask this particular question. But like, how was the process, or how did you go about building the relationships with the studios that you worked with? Because I think a lot of that, and like you said, from the transition to where you are now, a lot of where you are now is because of those relationships, because of the type of work that you have done on like co-projects or other things. So how was that process for you, building those like good relationships?
Yeah, there's a saying, I probably said it the last time we talked too, which was, there's nothing indie about indie game development, right? Like the reality is there's nothing independent about it. It's very much a collaborative effort. There are the lone wolves that sit and make their games and do explosively well, but those are very, very unusual. We are entirely word of mouth. So all of the work that we get for the work for hire aspect of the studio is one client loving the work that we did with them and recommending us to another client, which is phenomenal. But for the publishing, this is what's funny, is it's the opposite. I go and sit on different Reddits, Discords, Facebook groups, whatever, and I watch. I look, I check once a day all these different feeds, and I see like, is there something interesting out there that it's got an inkling of something really great, but it's not being looked at. And that's how I approach publishing, is I just cold email people. We don't have the infrastructure set up currently for people to start submitting us projects for review. We're so new to this. We're only on our 4th game, I think, right now. Yeah, I guess it's been 4 games or 5 games maybe. So like we're kind of being the ones to go out and pick, which is I think is very unusual. Most of the time, people have a public facing thing for their on their website for their publishing. But if you go on our website today, which is, from the date of the recording, I think it's August 31st right now, 2020, like there's nothing on there that would imply that we do any publishing at all. But that's just how we're functioning at the moment. And, we'll see how that goes a number of months from now.
Right. But you also don't want to like necessarily like imply the wrong information either to people, because I mean, like you said, this is still early on for you guys, and setting yourself up for trying to be. It's funny though, because everything has a situation where sometimes it's good to present yourself maybe bigger than what you actually are, but in this instance, it's like there's no real reason to it. It would go against basically everything you're working towards if you were to do that. So
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like we are, if anyone who's sort of done work with us knows that we don't go super far out of our ways to be out of our way to be loud.
mm,
We're not a loud group. We kind of go heads down. We do our stuff. We pop up for air. We sort of look around and see what's happening, and then when we pop up for air, we take that all in and we say like, okay, what's happening in the world is something that we should be thinking about. And I think this area is a natural fit because I think there are some advantages that SkyMap brings that maybe are unusual for other studios. A lot of other studios don't have. And it's not just the funding piece. The funding piece is anyone with cash can fund a game, and
right.
we can certainly fund games.
And we all think about the funding as the main core aspect because that's what generally everybody's looking for, right?
Yeah, I think it's basically funding and it's access to relationships.
Yeah.
Like I need access to, I'm a dev and I want to work with a publisher, and the publisher can fund my project. Yeah, but like, can they go and have a conversation with Microsoft that gets us a Games Pass deal?
Right.
Or go and have a conversation with Apple that gets us on an exclusivity for Apple Arcade. And those are the things that bring a lot of value. Along with there's a slew of other stuff that can bring value too.
Right.
And, but those are big deal for indie devs because like that can bring your game really to a new height if you're able to secure those types of conversations.
No, yeah, definitely. So one thing I'm also wondering too, and we talked about it a little bit, and you mentioned some parts of this, but like I want to talk a little bit about the process of making that shift into becoming a publisher, and I guess basically what was that process like, and what I'm looking for specifically, if you can, is to like. Could you provide some types of steps that you took to get to the point where you are today? Maybe like certain milestones or whatever that you can clearly identify?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to preface is we're still very much like in this process right now. But where we started was we were sort of reviewing at the beginning of this year, like, okay, what are we, what do we have on the table right now in terms of projects? Where do we want to be in a couple of years? And the conversation was really between the sort of co-founders and I was like, well, we want to be working on our own projects for sure. We want to continue doing work for hire for sure, but there's probably more ways to diversify our portfolio in between that process, right?
Mm.
And so we started having conversations about like, well, there's a lot of games in the sort of local Boston scene that maybe we should be taking a closer look at and asking the devs like, hey, do you, we have expertise in porting, we have expertise in working with the platform holders. And so we would start conversations, and one of the teams we started working with first was a team called Rude Ghost. And Rude Ghost is these two guys that are friends, which is a huge advantage, and they were making some really great games. One of which was a game called Thief Town, which had already released on PlayStation, and they were looking to bring it to the Switch and get sort of a second stab at trying to get the game out into the marketplace. And so we thought like, okay, well, that would be a really interesting first project for us to experiment with here because the game already released, it's people we know, and they're comfortable working with us and we're comfortable working with them. it's pretty low cost, and we can use this to sort of build out our